Okay, we're up to 19 now. I suggest we get started with the webinar. Welcome everybody. I'm your host today. So I'm going to be acting as chair and a second pair of eyes for Deepak. So I'll be looking at the questions and the chat, and if I feel the need to interrupt, I will, but I'll try not to. Yeah, please ask questions in the Q&A box, and I'll be monitoring those. You can like questions, and that will hasten people actually getting to ask them. I will try and allow you to join the panel to ask your questions. As and when we need, and in the end, we'll try and get a more open discussion about some methodological issues going. The topic today is methodological choices, and I'm really pleased we have Deepak here, who's going to give us a short presentation on that topic, and I'll be monitoring the questions. So just enjoy what Deepak has to say. Over to you, Deepak. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Steve. Thank you very much. So, as Steve mentioned earlier, this is, and as it is written also in the slide, that this is the third workshop in the series of 6 workshops that we are organizing on critical realism. So, first something about me, and then we'll move to you as well, actually, because I usually like to know my audience. First about myself. So I did my PhD from Trinity College, Dublin, Ireland, and critical realism was not basically handed to me. It was more because of this dissatisfaction I had with existing approaches, positivism as well as interpretivism. I had my own share of doubts in terms of, and you must have already read some bit of criticism in other texts, that with positivism, my main problem was that it leaves out many things that you cannot measure. And with interpretivism or constructivism, my main issue was that, okay, if everything is interpretation, then is there anything out there? And if there is, then how do we study that? So that brought me to critical realism. And I'm happy to share my journey with you guys. And particularly, I would like to clarify from the beginning that I don't claim to be an expert on CR, but I'm more like a fellow traveler who started slightly earlier than you. So I would like to share my experience rather than providing any definite guidelines or answers. So that's about me. So after finishing my PhD, successfully using critical realism, then I did my postdoc in Ireland for 3 years. And only last year I joined BITS Pilani in India. That is a QS top 500 university as an assistant professor. So that's about me. And since I come from a school of management, business school, so some bit of marketing, definitely we would appreciate. So if you want to tag in your tweets our center, so then the handle is engage CR. And if you want to simply talk about the workshop, so we are using the hashtag CR workshop. So now the topic of this particular workshop, methodology. So if you search in Cambridge Dictionary, and in fact, before I talk about this, just as Steve said earlier, feel free to post your question relevant to whatever we are talking about in Q&A, or if you want to comment something in general, you can use the chat box. So now coming back to the meaning of the term methodology. So Cambridge Dictionary defines it as a system of ways of doing, I would say simply things. So it could be a teaching methodology, but here we are more concerned about research methodology. That how do you conduct your research? What's the system of doing it? But the problem with this topic, when I was deciding about the precise content, the problem I faced that actually you cannot talk about methodology unless you have spoken at least about ontology and epistemology. and so which were covered in previous 2 workshops. So if you had attended it, well done. If you could not, the previous 2 talks are available on YouTube, on our center's YouTube channel, so you can have a look there. But here, even to situate my discussion on methodology, I would need to talk about these two. And those who are new to PhD process or in the middle of it, you might have seen also other term in your research methodology text about axiology, human nature, and methodology. So this slide is primarily based on the 3 references at the bottom of this slide. So ontology, it can be understood as your assumption about form and nature of reality. That, okay, how do you see what reality is, and what do you assume about, okay, what can be known about it? So here in this slide, I have just pointed out 2 extreme positions, but this does not mean that a specific philosophy will always take an extreme position. Even in terms of research paradigms or research philosophy, they are on a scale. So a philosophy may not be absolutely relativist or absolutely realist. So this is just to understand our discussion. And another reason of including this slide is in the past 2 workshops, I have seen students asking the question, these questions in terms of trying to situate CR. So in this particular slide, we are not situating CR, but we are laying the groundwork for understanding what CR is. So speaking of ontology, you could be a realist in terms of assuming that there is an external reality. It's a separate matter whether we can completely understand it or not, but at least if you assume there is an external reality, you are basically a realist. But if you assume that, okay, there is nothing like external reality, it's what we understand as a group, as a community, or as a researcher, then we are actually being a relativist. So these are the 2 extreme positions when you talk about ontology. Epistemology goes slightly, so it brings in a researcher, that, okay, what's the nature of relationship between the researcher and whatever can be known. So one position highly followed in positivist philosophy is objective, that we are here we are saying that phenomena has to be understood and has to be studied objectively, and researcher has no influence on it. So as I mentioned, positivist and quantitative methods usually assume that, whereas subjectivist epistemology will assume that whatever I think as a researcher, whatever my assumptions are, that actually influence my understanding about the reality. So that's the subjectivist position. Axiology is the term, it was used by Kern, and essentially 2 extreme positions. There are also middle positions, but 2 extreme positions are that your research could be or should be value free. That's one position. So again, positivists want their research to be value free, that no matter whether I do it or you do it, we follow a standard methodology, and we do not get our value to influence our research process. Whereas value driven research is actually brings in our value system into research process. So for instance, if I am a critical theorist, I probably want to highlight inequalities, highlight class relations, so that some change can happen. So I'm completely driven by my value if I'm a critical theorist. Then next level, and this term was primarily discussed by Burrell and Morgan in the context of methodology, in the context of research paradigms. But this broadly mirrors structure versus agency debate in general, written about in sociology and many other social sciences. And even in CR, Margaret Archer has written extensively about structure versus agency. So essentially here, one extreme could be voluntarism, that we are saying that humans have complete agency over their action, whereas other extreme could be determinism. So just giving an extreme example here. So a physicist might argue that, see, we all are made up of atoms and quarks, and all these atoms and quarks, say including our brain, they are driven by physical laws. So essentially, everything is determined. Of course, not all physicists will argue that. I'm just giving an extreme example, but that would be an example of determinist assumption about human nature. And last, which is the central topic of our today's workshop, is methodology. That, okay, taking all these assumptions, how do I go about finding what is known? So what is my system? What are my steps? So one set of extreme position could be nomothetic. Again, positivism favors it, that irrespective of the research problem, irrespective of the researcher, you follow a standard set of data collections, standard set of methods, statistical testing, etc. So that's nomothetic. Whereas the other extreme is ideography, that depending upon the research problem and also value system of the researcher, you decide that, okay, this would be the better method. So there is a lot of flexibility, and that's why it is ideographic, because it is specific to a research context. So now let us see where does CR fit here. And again, see, this whole workshop will be a list of disclaimers, because research philosophy is a very complex topic. So all this table is basically based on a number of readings and based on my own understanding. So people from the attendees or even from the panels may differ based on understanding, and that's absolutely fine, because academia progresses by such kind of argumentation and assessments. So, okay, so coming back to CR, so its ontology is realist, as the name itself suggests, critical realist. As CR researchers, we assume that there is an external reality, but we don't assume that we can completely understand it. So that's the critical position. That's the critical in critical realism, that we are critical about our own understanding, and we are saying that it is subject to our existing knowledge base, and no matter how much knowledge we create, perhaps we won't be able to completely understand it. So that's the ontological position in CR. Whereas epistemological position is subjective, in the sense that yes, there is an external reality, but you may comprehend it in a different way than I do. So that's what it makes it subjective, and that's where critical realism avoids conflation. So many times a realist position or positivist position, naive realist position, it will subscribe to objectivist epistemology, and relativist ontology will subscribe to subjective position. But here CR actually doesn't club the two, and it assumes, yes, there is an external reality, but we all can have different understanding of it. In terms of axiology, Sayer particularly says that it's in CR, it's not about value driven or value free, it's more theory laden. So what does it mean? It basically means that whatever set of theories we are considering in terms of explaining the phenomena that we are studying. So our explanation will impact actually by those theories. So that's why it is theory laden. And in fact, here I also would like to invoke Bhaskar, who said that the job of critical realist philosophy or a philosopher is that of an under-laborer. So essentially that means that CR doesn't claim to provide any theory, but CR provides the base upon which you can bring in theory. So that's what one thing. It would be better to keep that into mind when you are bringing in CR. Moving to human nature. So what CR assumes that yes, there is agency, it is voluntary, but it is within the constraint of reality. And in fact, perhaps a better way to put that would be that it is not in CR, it is not about structure versus agency. In CR, it is about structure and agency. So that would be my take on it based on my limited understanding. Then methodology, and here this I'll explain in more detail in next slides. But essentially, it follows what Cook calls critical multiplism. So which means that in terms of data collection, we rely on multiple sources of evidence. In terms of providing theory, in terms of explanation, we consider a number of different explanations, and we can also discard some certain explanation because they are inadequate. So this is basically the core of CR based methodology. So now let's proceed. Now let's go to the nuts and bolts of so just assuming that okay, you and your supervisor, you guys have agreed that okay, CR is the right methodology and it also aligns with your worldview. So then how do you go about actually implementing it in terms of a research study? So here I am taking a particular aspect from Bhaskar's version of CR. So Bhaskar argues that reality can be understood in terms of three levels. Experiences or empirical is the topmost level. So whatever we observe, whatever we can note, whatever we can measure, that is at the level of empirical. Whereas the bottommost level is of underlying structure and mechanisms. So here again, some critical realists only talk about generative mechanism. So they don't club structure at the level of real, but some other, so like Sayre particularly argues that structure and mechanism are at the level of real. So just to understand that in the bottom up manner, so there are structure and mechanism existing at the level of real. Not every structure will have impact. Not every mechanism will be enacted, but whatever mechanism is enacted, they will result in certain events, and those events are at the level of actual. But not all events can be seen by us. So whatever events we can see, we can measure, they are at the level of empirical. So one question might be asked that, okay, at what level you collect data in a CR based study? So the fact that you are able to collect data essentially makes it empirical. So whatever data about your phenomena, about your research problem you are able to collect, by definition itself, that will be a level of empirical, because if it is not empirical, then you wouldn't be able to collect data about it. So that's one question that was asked in one of earlier sessions. So I thought better to clear it here itself. So the purpose of a critical realist study in general, Bhaskar and many other critical realists argue that is to take the events that we observe, that we uncovered, and then look for mechanisms that, if they existed and enacted, if they could have produced these events under consideration. So normally, or I would say ideally, if you are doing a CR based study, ideally your research question should have the term mechanism in the question itself. So that makes it distinctly a CR based study. So I'll give my own example here. So I was doing my research on enterprise system implementation in organizations, and existing research more than 20-25 years focused on identifying critical success factors. So my main problem with that stream of research was that there were more than 50 critical success factors, and depending upon your sample size, depending upon your geography, you would come up with different critical success factors. But my argument was that below these factors, there should be certain mechanisms that are powering or propelling these factors, that are resulting in the emergence of these factors. So my I ended up my research question as what are the critical success factors and underlying mechanisms in enterprise system implementation. So either you could directly have the term mechanism in your research question, or if you have a how type question. So how do certain events happen or do not happen? Or say how, say in the field of education, so how do certain initiatives are taken up or not taken up? So then whenever you are asking how question, it is highly likely that CR would be able to help you and would be able to provide you answer in terms of mechanisms, that okay, because of the existence of such and such mechanism, these events happen or fail to happen. CR accepts either position that if the mechanisms were enacted, they can result in certain events, and if they're not, then they can result in something else. So that's about research question. Hang on a second. Let me check if there is anything important here. Okay, so let's proceed. So assuming you have a hold on your research question. So the next question from methodology point of view is that how do you decide which kind of data you collect? And if you, based on a cursory reading of CR, you will find that CR supports all three types of data. So or studies, so quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method. So here one more clarification I would like to bring in, that many people talk in terms of qualitative versus quantitative research, but if you do a careful reading of methodology text, you will find that qualitative and quantitative distinction is more in terms of data you collect, not the whole research approach per se. So for instance, case study is considered a quantitative, a qualitative method. But if within a case study, I might collect a lot of quantitative data to justify certain points, or to see the impact on certain variables. So that's always possible. Similarly, if you are doing a quantitative study, say using surveys, even in surveys, people add qualitative descriptive type questions to be answered. So there you are also collecting qualitative data. So it is always better to talk to differentiate data in qualitative versus quantitative, rather than differentiating between the approaches. So that would be my take. So now coming back to our central question, that okay, what kind of data I would like to collect if I am doing a CR based study, and how do I decide? So in this, Sayer has a very good guideline. So what he says that there can be three types of change, and one might ask, okay, why suddenly I'm talking about change? So the about change, it is crucial to understand, because see, there may be some certain structure and mechanisms will result in certain events. So that means this will take time. Enactment of mechanisms and their impact on events, and then later on when you empirically observe it, this takes time. So that's why there is a talk about change, that you are studying this potentially over time to see the influence of certain mechanisms, to see how certain events are preceded by some other events and result in certain events, certain other events. That's why the talk of change. So what Sayer says that some change will be purely quantitative, like there will be no doubt among those who are studying it that okay, this is it. So for instance, income level is so you can precisely measure the income of people. So that's purely quantitative change. Second type of change would be that yes, it will have qualitative element, but still there will be some quantitative aspect to it that can be easily measured. So for example, if I want to measure a change in lifestyle, so in many countries there are nationwide survey that will ask people say whether they whether they have a car, whether they own a house, and underdeveloped economies, there will be questions like whether they own a smartphone or TV. So there you can still quantify it to a bit, because these there is no doubt. Like if I own a car or I do not own, there is a clear answer. There is nothing about interpretation here. And finally, then the third type of change will be irreducibly qualitative, that it will be completely qualitative. For instance, what I argue that subjective well-being is irreducibly qualitative. So although yes, there are questionnaires and in psychology plus some well-being companies, they try to put a number on it. But as a critical realist, I would argue that subjective well-being is a phenomena, is a change that's inherently qualitative. So you can put a number, but it still wouldn't capture the complete reality. So what Sayre says that first two, it's okay. First one, definitely you can use mathematical aspects, essentially quantitative data. Second one, yes, that's possible. So if you choose the correct indicators, still that's fine. But for the third type of change, you have to use qualitative methods or qualitative data. So that's what my take also would be. And in fact, that's where CR adds its value. Like if you have to use completely quantitative, perhaps you're better off using positivism. You would have less to justify, but a CR based study would go beyond statistical regularity, and it will search for what is called demi-regularity. So regularity in terms of event, and then it would like to search that, okay, what are the mechanisms that underpin these events? So that would be my take on which kind of data you would collect in a CR-based study. So now, this is, in my view, this is perhaps the most important slide in terms of methodology perspective, that what are the steps you would use when you are doing a CR-based study. So if you want to have a quick summary of various approaches, so there has been approaches proposed by Bhaskar, proposed by Dennermark, then Wayne and Williams. They also wrote a paper, 2012 paper on principles of critical realist study, principles for conducting critical realist case study. So here in this paper, they actually mention all these models, all the different steps, and they also try to summarize it in a nice way. So for a quick summary, that would be my first point of contact. And then whatever approach you find more interesting and more relevant to your discipline and research problem, you can explore deeper. So based on my own, how I used it, plus how I understood by reading these different approaches, this can be summarized into these 5 aspects. So first one is more of an aspect, and 2 to 5, they are more of stages or steps to be done in sequential manner. So first and most important aspect of any CR-based study, and if you remember a few slides back, I spoke about critical multiplism. So you have to be serious about triangulation. So it works at multiple levels. So first, yes, triangulation within a sample. So for instance, if you're doing a case study in an organization, talk to people at different levels so that you get different perspective. Then even within a level, talk to people, say from different departments or from different who bring in different aspects basically. So this we do to ensure that we get a holistic understanding of events under consideration. So triangulation, so this could be done within a single method, plus this also should be done using multi-methods. So for instance, say when you are doing social research, you always have some bit of secondary data, because perhaps that secondary data raised your interest in this particular problem. So there may be news reports, there may be, say, reports from governments. So for instance, if it is education, it is about education, a change in education policy, so then there may be, say, a policy paper from the Ministry of Education in that country. Or if it is about, say, some change in health, so then there may be some position papers or some white papers, say from say, if we talk about UK, so there will be from NHS or any equivalent health service organization in your country. So always collect that secondary data because that will give you a way to sequence events and to also triangulate whatever your participants are telling. And if possible, then also use observation. So these three I find more useful. Others can also be useful. So for instance, in one of the, I forgot the name of the authors, but in one of the recent, I think it was by Pentland. So in their recent paper, they actually used IT logs to uncover certain mechanisms and to do a critical realist study. So whatever evidence you can get, primary, secondary, go for it. And if you can complement it with observation, there is nothing like it. So so that's would be the first thing to consider when you are going for data collection for a CR based study. So now what you could do in a step-by-step manner. So first thing I would do, I could start doing it with based on secondary data, and then I can reaffirm it with help of my primary data, is that you identify key entities and key events. So so taking that education example, perhaps that the key entities will be say Ministry of Education in that country. There may be regional education board or provincial education board, then schools, school cluster or particular school. So they may be key entities, and there may be different events, say release of the policy, discussion on the policy. So you identify these key entities and events, and which entities you consider, that will also depend upon the level of analysis you are going with, whether you are working at organization level or macro level. So, but idea is identifying those key entities. In a health situation, perhaps some event, so like COVID will be a crucial event. So those who have started study now, so for them, invariably COVID will be an event that would have impacted the provision of health service in a certain area. So you first identify those key entities and events, collect more data on that, and then your third stage is you do description of those entities, structures, and events. So here I would suggest do not try to involve theory too much. And why do I say so? I got this tip from Walcott, who wrote a book on writing up qualitative research, and that this tip immensely benefited me. That if you bring in theory, if you bring in your theoretical lens, you may ignore certain events, you may ignore certain evidence. So here, rather than thinking in terms of theory, just think in terms of just see yourself as a reporter or as an investigator, that you just want to describe what's out there, whatever you could understand based on your data. So so if you are writing a PhD thesis, this step 3 basically will be your case study chapter, that try to give as complete and as holistic description of the structure, various structures involved, various entities, various events. So now, assuming if you have done this in a complete manner, so now the next, and that's a now the difficult job starts, that you have to identify what are the candidate mechanisms. You may have, some of you who have started reading on CR, you may have read the term abduction, retroduction, and retroduction perhaps. So abduction is more about the overall logic of a CR based study. So abduction is seen on par with the induction and deduction, whereas retroduction and retroduction are considered by majority of critical realists Some of them may actually differ though, so that it is a specific step. So if I have some idea on mechanism based on my past literature review, so then that is retroduction. So if I take any existing mechanism, or even if it is not mechanism, it may be simply a concept. So that will be retroduction. But if I don't find anything in existing literature and I propose a mechanism based on my data, so then this process will be called retroduction. So in ideal scenario, it will be good. And this is again primarily from a PhD perspective. A post-PhD research work may not confine to it. That from a PhD perspective, you are in a win-win position if you are able to show both retroduction and retroduction. What does it mean? When you do retroduction, you use some existing mechanism or concept. So that means you are using existing theory. When you do retroduction, you come up with say 2-3 new mechanisms. So then in that way, you're advancing the theory. So if you are able to do that, that would be the best win-win situation from a viva perspective. In my situation, so what I, in terms of retroduction, I used a couple of mechanisms. So affordance is accepted as a mechanism in the information systems literature. So I used that, but along with alongside that, I also had to bring in some new mechanisms to explain. So it was a combination of both, and at least for me, it worked fine. So, but at this stage, you still may not be too sure that, okay, whatever mechanism I have, this say 3, 4, 5 mechanisms, are they right? Are they correct? So what do you do? So then you go to step 5, that you try to redescribe. So whatever events you described in step 3, you do a redescription of those events using your mechanisms. So that's the step 5. And then this step 4 and 5 are actually, they go in circles. So if you are not able to explain or redescribe the event in terms of your mechanism, go back to step 4, think of certain, some other mechanisms. So that actually also takes me to my next slide, that how do I know? So my first test would be that I am able to explain whatever majority of the events I described in stage 3. I'm able to explain those events under consideration using my set of mechanisms. And again, I'll draw from my own experience here. Okay, let me have a... So then number 5 are causal explanations. Yes, yes, that's correct. So step number 5, essentially you are trying to bring in causal explanation using the mechanisms. So that's precisely correct. Okay, so now coming back. So in my case, what happened that based on my prior literature review, I thought that, okay, there is technology, there is change. So why don't I bring in affordance mechanism to cover the technology, and some change related mechanism to cover for change. So, but when I went to step 5, when I started redescribing these events using my hypothesized mechanisms, it did not work, because for change related mechanism, to justify that, I did not have sufficient data. I had to make a leap of faith, and I had to make too many assumptions. So that told me that perhaps this explanation, this causal explanation is not correct. So then I went back to theory, then I went back to data as well. So another thing that I tried, so Giddens structuration theory, I actually liked reading that. So I thought, okay, let's see if I can. So one of the mechanism was aligning with Giddens structuration theory. So then I thought, okay, why don't I bring this theory and see if that works? So again, I had the same problem, that I was not able to explain all events using the set of mechanisms supported by structuration theory. So, okay, Marina, I will come back to your question after finishing this particular slide. So then I went back to actually to data. I did, so this time I did coding or thematic, qualitative coding on thematic analysis. So I took it from say first order code based on data. You club those first order codes in second order, and then those second order codes I clubbed into mechanisms. So there, once I went to data and then certain mechanisms. So third stage, when you are clubbing second order code to explain the mechanisms, again, you need to go back to theory. And many times you don't even confine to your discipline. So for instance, the affordance mechanism that I have been talking about, and information system literature has been writing a lot about that. So this concept was, it has no relation, it had no relation to critical realism per se. So it emerged in the field of psychology, and then sociology adopted it, and then other fields adopted it. And only later on, it was argued that affordance is a form of a mechanism. Similarly, some scholars argue that institutionalization, that is also a mechanism. So institutional theory, there is an institutional theory, I'm sure most of you are aware of. So some critical realists argue that actually institutionalization is also a mechanism. So that begs the question that many of you are actually asking that, okay, what do I mean by mechanism? So I think that's the now right time to talk about it. Okay, so when I say structure versus mechanism, my own understanding is that it is that what is unchanging, at least for the duration of your research, I will take more or less as structure, and whatever is changing and having some influence on events, so that I would consider as mechanism. In fact, Steve, would you like to come in on the comment that, okay, instead of the term mechanism, you would prefer generative structure?
Yeah, hang on a sec. Yeah, well, my own research is sort of like organizational research, you know, and I use the term mechanism a bit, you know, but I see mechanisms in terms of comings together of people, things, practices to produce an effect, and that effect is the sum of the relations. You know, the parts are combining to produce an effect that is more than the individual parts, but it's not actually an entity. You know, it might be constituted of entities. You know, you might have an interorganizational relationship that's constituted of people, contracts, meetings, you know, and that mechanism, the interorganizational relationship, you know, has this label, interorganizational relationship, that describes the set of relations that makes up the connections between organizations. And you can consider that, I'd consider that to be a mechanism, but it's a series of entities coming together to have a particular causal effect. You know, yeah, so yeah, that's perhaps how it works in my head.
Okay, thanks, Steve, for mentioning that. And in fact, I think that is why even when I was doing my research, I did not confine myself to only to generative mechanisms, because, and if you read Sayer's book, actually that reference, that book is mentioned in the next slide. So he clearly talks about structure and mechanism. So it is not always mechanism in isolation. There would be certain structure beneath it that would be resulting in the emergence of those mechanisms. So for instance, what Steve mentioned, that entities coming together to result in something in terms of events. So that coming together is basically can be construed as a mechanism. So Marina asked two questions. One about, say, is a variable mechanism. So in quantitative studies, many scholars and they primarily come from positivist background. So all they consider intervening variable as a mechanism, but that's not as per CR. That's not mechanism for CR. If you are measuring it, it is at the level of empirical. So mechanism is at the level of real, that you cannot prove as such, but you can hypothesize and you can justify existence of that mechanism. So that would be my answer to Marina's first question. And then there was another question. Okay, let me have a look. I would like to. Okay, so another term is causal power on causal mechanisms. And in fact, the interesting bit there is that when I was finishing my research, I found that the idea of mechanism was also independently proposed in organizational theory. So it did not have any relation to critical realism per se, but the idea of mechanism as causal powers was actually proposed there. And I'm sure in many other disciplines, the idea of mechanisms might be discussed even without invoking critical realism. At least in information systems, someone wrote about social mechanism. So that to me, yeah, it is about causal power, that it results in something, it results in some change. So Steve, do you want to come in now?
Yeah, sure, if I can. Yeah, because I think this is an interesting part of the debate, around realism anyway. I often write without thinking in as mechanism or structure or, but the idea that ideas allow access to things that explain event regularities. There's theories in my era about the labor process that suggests that organizations are necessarily hierarchical in capitalist competition. And this is due to the problem of controlling labor. When people turn up in the morning, how hard they work in any given day is subject to variation, depending on whether they went out and got drunk the night before, or whether they're not feeling well, or whether they're just feeling a bit down in the mouth. So as a consequence, because there's competition between firms, it's difficult for firms to put away with the trappings of bureaucratic control. And I've just described what goes on in most organizations which don't suspend with hierarchy, that do affect systems of control that often negatively affect their employees' well-being. And I haven't used the notion mechanism or structure or at all, but it's all in there. The structure is the nature of competition between firms, and how competition between firms means that they're under pressure to make things more efficiently, and they also need to turn a profit. And so there's another mechanism there associated with firm ownership, and how that then drives firms to structure themselves in particular ways. And so when we're sort of like describing the world, we can use the term mechanism, but as Deepak said, it's often best to start by describing the world and what it's like, and to look at existing theory. You've got labor process theories there. It sort of precedes Basker's writing, but it has an implicitly very similar ontological position, in that you need theory in order to explain empirical regularities, and that's common to a lot of research. This idea that actually you need theory in order to explain the events. A famous critical realist, I think he's famous, called Steve Fleetwood, has this phrase: theoretically informed and empirically substantiated explanation. So you need theory in order to develop an explanation with causal depth. that doesn't reduce anything merely to patterns in data or the things that people say happen, because other stuff is needed to actually explain what goes on. So that was a bit of a rant, but the idea of mechanism is there implicit within that. But we come at the world from our own subject disciplines, and these have their own theories about the stuff that happens. And I'll be coming back in a few weeks to talk about critical realism as a framework, but it's there. It's acting as an underlaborer in my mind to how I think about how the levels of reality are connected to affect events, and the way we need theory about the generative stuff, the mechanisms, the structures, the causal powers. The terms are themselves quite clunky. You find they're a bit sort of like boxy, but it's best to work with the natural data and the existing theory, and to try and use critical realism in a sort of underlaboring capacity in order to generate better explanations for events. That was a bit of a rant, and I apologize, but I don't know, the questions motivated me to say it.
No, Steve, that's actually a very valuable input. And that brings me to my third bullet point, that you are better off, when you are doing a critical realism study, we are slightly better off if some of your mechanisms are supported by existing theories. What does this mean? That some of the concepts may already be there. They may not be defined as a mechanism as such, but if you can see that they have causal power, if you can explain the change or the sequence of events based on those concepts, those can be justified as mechanism. So Steve mentioned about Fleetwood. So I think it was his 2000 paper, Accurate and pardon me if my pronunciation is incorrect. So Accurate and Fleetwood 2000 chapter. They argued that many of the theories and many of the researchers are actually implicitly realist, and many of the concepts, including institutional theory, that are not explained invoking the term mechanism, are actually mechanism in the CR sense of it. So again, taking a step back, the meaning of the term mechanism for me would be that any idea, any concept that has certain causal power on events, I would call it as mechanism. And in fact, almost similar understanding or theory can be developed by someone using interpretivism, but they may not be considering using the term mechanism per se, because they do not subscribe to critical realism. So that would be my take on it. So I think Caroline wants to come in here. So Caroline.
Yeah, I hope my internet helps me. What I wanted to say here in my own research, something that would be so obvious. So I was looking at how questions, so how do undergraduates engage with open and participatory tools? And the mechanisms were the answer. So the generative mechanisms that caused the engagement or the lack of. And socio-technical relations and the identity, the social identity of tools in an institution, although we know them, but I think that we use them to explain the demi-regularities, makes them our mechanisms for the context of our research. And that, I think, is what our experience in the field and, the knowledge we have while we're teaching or, whatever it is. But I think our experience in a way gives us, because I was wondering when I was saying, well, socio-technical relations, that's everywhere. Yes, but in my case, if the tool wasn't mainstream in the institution, if it has not a social identity that was meaningful in the institution, well, no one will use it. It seems evident and one feels stupid because you kind of think, well, this is, but I think that finding that explains your event is really the thing that is revealing, if you wish. And I think that when people read it that are not immersed in your work, they then say, wow, I didn't think about this. So I think that, yeah, just is a lot of what really explains the events that you're looking at, and that is important when you look at the mechanisms, I wanted to say.
Yeah, I think currently that's very spot on. Can you explain how? And that is precisely my last bullet point here. That if you were doing an interpretive study, most likely you would be explaining what happened, and you explain it in its full richness. But if you are doing a CR-based study, you will explain with help of mechanism that, okay, this is how it happened. Certain mechanisms were enacted, there was certain interaction among mechanism, and that's how things happen or did not happen. So, like as an example, my post PhD work, I worked with a couple of collaborators on refugee entrepreneurship. So what we found that it essentially followed, there is a small business development model since 80s, and refugee entrepreneurship also follows that model, that stages. But what value we added as critical realist is that we could show that for each stage, there are certain mechanisms that either support that stage or inhibit that stage. So for instance, for refugees, access to ICT. So using WhatsApp is perhaps that we found that it was very beneficial. So their ICT was working as a mechanism to support that process. But when they wanted to expand, they do not have sufficient bandwidth or knowledge about, say, e-commerce, for instance. So there it worked as inhibiting the stages. So whichever discipline you are working in, you might find that, yes, there are certain models and there are certain theories, but you can still add values by explaining how, by using your mechanisms. So that would be my take on it. And just some bit of personal plug-in here. So if you want to discuss more on, want to see something more on this, whatever ideas I discussed in this workshop. So first paper is essentially on planning the critical realist case study. So from thinking of a research question to going for final publications. So here I have shared my thoughts. This is unfortunately by is behind the paywall, behind the publisher paywall, but I'm on ResearchGate, and you know what to do next. Second one is what I was talking about, going back to my data, using the qualitative coding process to come up with mechanisms. So here in the second one, and this is an open source one, here I have described in detail that, okay, how I use the coding process to come up with mechanism. So I hope that might be of some use. So that, I think that's where I stop in terms of what I wanted to talk about. Just one last slide here, and then we'll be open for more discussion. So there is a lot of text on critical realist philosophy itself. So you can go back to Bhaskar, you can go back to Margaret Archer. But in terms of methodology, these are the two texts. One is Andrew Sayre. So 1992 was the first edition. 2010 is the revised second edition with additional commentary from Sayre, and Maxwell's book on realist approach to qualitative research. These two I found really useful in answering my doubts related to methodology. So I hope for you guys also, it might be very useful. So with that, I'll stop. So if you have any other questions, or if you want to come in, we actually welcome you to unmute and
yeah, let's see if we can get a discussion going. You know, if anybody has any points of clarification or particular questions about anything Deepak's raised, either raise your hand or place a question in the Q&A stream, which is below you there. and you can raise your hand. There's a little button at the bottom of the screen to enable you to do that. Now, I'd be particularly interested to hear if anyone's got any methodological issues that they're confronting at the moment in relation to using critical realism, what you're struggling with, and or how you're using critical realism as a basis for your own methodology. Would be interesting to hear some stories so we can share those.
Okay, so Tobias raised hand, so you may go ahead, please.
Yeah, so I'm trying to apply critical realism to skill acquisition research. I wrote my dissertation, and actually now after about the first half of the presentation, I realized I kind of have been going back and forth on my rewrite manuscript, but realized how to really phrase this in a critical realism perspective. I have no social justice aspect on mine, and I guess that's kind of an area where I'm struggling in the methodological side. Is my question really does not have social justice element. The issue is that in skill acquisition, there's internal states that just aren't researched, and I believe those are mechanisms that then allow for expertise to emerge from practice, and practice is then the structure. And I guess all the empirical research has given us kind of the some of the shapes of that structure, or what what the construction items would be involved in that structure, but there's nothing to really explain the internal state of the learner and how learning occurs as a phenomenon in the mechanism area.
There's Archer's written a little bit on practice, where she looks at different aspects of the things we might think of as skill. On the one hand, you've got the interaction with the real world, if you will, in terms of using tools and things like that. But on the other hand, you've got the ideas and theories upon which which become embodied and ingrained. So there is a little bit in Archer on the development of practice within agency. And you might want to look there, but it seems to be a theoretical question more than something that's easy to do empirically. This is one area of I've written quite a lot on skills, and a little bit from a critical realist position, but in the context of working environments, and that they need to be developed, they need to be employed, they need to be used, they need to be valued in order for a skill to be actualized in the context of a workplace setting. And so we in our research, we're sort of like breaking it down that way. But the idea of development that takes place over time, doesn't it, and involves again interactions. Sorry, I'm waffling on. If you want to respond to
that. No, yeah, and I guess for me, where I'm the area I'm researching at is not it's at the elite level of skill development. So it's once you've reached expertise, then what comes after that? How do you then because I guess what I'm looking at is there is a difference between pro athletes and amateur athletes and recreational athletes. So within pro athletes, they restructure how they learn once they reach a certain level. And it's understanding that I feel is where all of our current theory falls short, deliberate practice or any of the other mastery-based theory. They have a large amount of empirical, of unexplained empirical variance, which says that, okay, these maybe are, in a critical realist perspective, these are pieces of the structure then that they've somewhat shined a little light on, but there's a whole bunch of mechanism that hasn't even been looked at for how expert athletes move their skill from expert to elite.
Yeah, I wonder again, back to the important second to last slide of Deepak, whether you can overcomplicate the world by bringing in what is essentially critical realist jargon. Where what you want to do is start understanding what learning was like for these people and what step changes occurred in their practice in order for them to move from very good to elite. And then that becomes your evidence of the events, if you will, and the reasons for the events from the point of view of your research participants, and then you are dealing with an act of retroduction, like as Deepak suggested, there is no good theory in this area, so you need to extract it from the data that's actually available. And so
I guess, yeah, and so I'm specifically out right now because I just finished my dissertation, is really my interview showed that this athlete who I've been working with for about 6 years, so I've actually observed kind of his whole career, and then made him my subject for my dissertation. He, in the interview, he explained how he fundamentally changed his approach and then his skills, then he started moving into the elite level.
Yeah, well, that you have a case study of one then.
Yeah.
Well, that has its strengths and limitations. The limitation is you're dealing only with the unique case and what happens in the world in terms of that athlete's experiences.
Yeah, and I have my longitudinal notes from working with them for the past 4 years as well. So I have as a coach, as a performance coach. So I do have 4 years of notes, if you will, observation.
Well, I wonder whether the language of mechanism and structure is as appropriate as the language of agency and that's what Margaret Archer's approach. People have desires, and people have projects they're trying to achieve, and even you can go back to Giddens here, and it's there in critical realism as well. The idea that the agent can transform themselves as they transform their capacities to think and conceive of the world. And in doing so, in the case of an athlete, they're also then transform their bodies and their abilities to play the game or jump over the hurdle or whatever it is they do. So I wonder whether the language of structure and mechanisms is the right place to locate your thinking for this particular study, or whether you should be thinking in terms of agency changing itself as a consequence of its interactions with the world.
That makes sense. Yeah. So it's an agency question versus a structure, and that makes sense. Thank you.
The structures then become the constraints that the agent has to confront as they're engaged in their project, which is to become an elite athlete, and the learning required to take on that journey.
No, that makes sense. That's it. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
So now we have Ronald. Yeah.
I think I've.
So Ronald Stein, do you want to come in?
I don't. Yeah, I don't think. I don't. I think you have to enable a Deepak.
Yeah,
Yes,
just enabled. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for the interesting presentation, Deepak. I don't so much have a question, as I was just responding to Steve's invitation to maybe talk a bit about my research and think through it with you. So I'm doing a kind of a macro study on the history of doctoral education in South Africa. Mm-hmm. My question sort of has evolved to question what are the mechanisms involved in the changing purposes, the changing practices, and the changing access that we have, that we see in doctoral education and research education. And I've been using Margaret Archer a lot. But as I've been doing this PhD project for a number of years, to be honest, and I became very interested in the history of South Africa and our decolonial and the colonial past and the whole decolonial theory. Yeah. So just to bring this back to a question and maybe engage a bit with what Deepak was talking about, as I saw your 5-point plan, I felt both comforted and also a little bit worried, because I'll tell you, my worry is that I've been using history books. I am not a historian, so I haven't been able to, I don't have time to go into the archives and do, that kind of analysis. So in your step 3, mm-hmm. if I use secondary sources like historical events that it's fairly uncontroversial, let's say. And so I use that as my descriptive phase. And then I think my contribution is then to do a critical realist interpretation of that. So once I've written down basically what, for me it was news, there's history, but I think historians would find it fairly uncontroversial. And then the work I'm doing is the retroduction, where I'm saying, if we look at that from a mechanism point of view, and then what I hope to end up with is like saying, if we understand how we got where we are today and the mechanisms that were involved, it's very arterial, and then we can also kind of see where we can go from here and what would be needed to change if we wanted to change. I hope that makes sense and that you will reassure me that I'm on the right track.
Yeah, it does actually make sense. So depending upon the research problem, your evidence will matter. So because you are focusing on historical trends, that's fine, that you use secondary data. Plus another additional thing is that even within history, people always collect from different sources, and same series of events can be interpreted in a different manner. So there you are okay, because I'm sure you must be using multiple sources rather than say simply using a couple of sources in step 3. And as Caroline was also mentioning earlier, that when you explain these series of events using mechanism, that's your distinct contribution. So I think you are on the right track, but you need to show the right balance of retroduction versus retroduction to say that, okay, you contributed something additional, some additional knowledge to this world. So that would be my take. Any of the panelists, do you want to come in to this?
I posted a link in the chat to a guy called Alistair Much, and he's written quite a bit on history from the point of view of critical realist approach. He's a business historian, amongst other things, but he's a well-known critical realist. Archer's original dissertation, I think, was a history of education, original thesis, which I'm sure she did many moons ago, but I don't know whether that might be somewhere you might want to look. But I think if you're getting a sense of what happens, then there's that's what history is, you know what I mean? So getting it from secondhand sources, if you will, I don't think that's fundamentally compromise your contribution. If your contribution is a critical realist theorization that explains the particularities of the evolution of organization or education that you observe.
Yeah, thanks. And in fact, I have been relying quite heavily on, I think I'm one of the few people that still quote Archer 1979 a lot. Yeah, but I just find it a really useful study, and it's like opened my eyes to seeing history in a new way. So, but thanks for your comments and for the link. I'll follow up.
Thanks, Ronald, for coming in. And I just want to check with Magdalena. I think you raised your hand earlier, but you put it down. So do you want to come in now to discuss your point?
Well, I am an English teacher, and then in Cancun, in the city of Cancun. And what I wanted to find out, why do language learners choose to shape or resist their access to English as a foreign language in the city of Cancun? And then, as you have proposed, I started by setting the context, which is the city of Cancun. And before doing my research, I thought that English was like everywhere in Cancun, but then I realized that it is not until people start working with tourists or they go to the hotel zone. Otherwise, they are not exposed to English. And what I did, I followed Elderbas, the stages proposed by Elderbas. And then, as you were talking, so I took the language learner as a whole, to find out about their agency, and including their personality, personal projects, as suggested by Archer. The thing is that I did my PhD online, and my supervisor, I'm based in Cancun, Mexico, and my supervisor is in the UK, but she had no idea about critical realism, but she was open enough to learn with me or through me. And then I think I made like a kind of a salad. And then I wanted to see, how the contextual conditions impact on language learners. And then I took the sociocultural configurations where they interact, as well as the institutions and the physical environment, the city of Cancun, and objects they use to interact in English. There's their mobile smart or mobile phones, as well as their imagined communities or social networks. And I took into considerations also their social economic status. And then I use en vivo, and then in my mind, the causal powers were like their dispositional formations, their projects, their interests, beliefs, and how they took decisions, yes, whether consciously done or not, that they had been affected by constraints. And then the relationships, how they were using English. Yes, and as well as the impact of knowing English in Cancun is a symbolic capital. Yes, because as I had to learn it on my own, I used Elderbas' book, The Causal Powers of Social Structure, so I was heavily influenced by that. And I also believe that I use Bourdieu theories I know Bourdieu and Archer are competing theories, but I do believe, and I agree with Elder Vaz, that they are not really competing, but they help to understand the phenomena of language learning. But where I got lost, because I did the abduction process, then the retroduction, I tried to do the retroduction using Archer's theory, trying to, the explanation about the causal mechanism underlying structures or underlying structures responsible for the events. The events were whether the students were willing or not to develop their language learning. But,
yeah.
And yes, and then I got like kind of lost, because what I did is I said with the morphogenetic and morphostatic causes, with the retroduction, because
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes.
You've made the picture very complicated. I'm sure it is.
Yes, it is.
And I think you are dealing with a number of different conditions which are interacting in different ways to affect whether or not people have a propensity to struggle with English, to learn English. And you were talking about spatial considerations, social cultural considerations, the networks and how they're connected through technologies, and then and that sort of the stuff external to the agent. And then within the agent, you were talking about, their dispositions, their interests, their projects, and so, I think you need to start distilling some of this stuff in a more systematic way. Some of it is context, and some of it is agency. And it's the particular interactions of the two that results in a situation where people tend not to learn. I'm not going to be able to provide you with ready answers, but I think you're overcomplicating the phenomena that you're trying to address, and you need to think about how you separate the data that's about the context and the parts of the context. There's stuff about technology and networks there, and there's stuff about the configuration of the city, and there's stuff about the local culture, and that's the context. The Archer talks about the cultural context and the structural context, and she sees them as two different causal things. And then the individual is traveling through this space and they're not learning English, and the question then is why. And there's probably a number of different reasons why, and the causal mechanism won't be the same for everyone that's not learning English. And so perhaps one thing you might do is interrogate your data in terms of types of non-English learner. Some mechanisms will be stronger for some individuals. Their social networks might be more important, whereas for other, their geographical location in the city or the things their parents did in order to earn a living are probably more causal in relation to them. I don't know. I've not got your data, but what one thing you might do is start pattern matching within and amongst the different non-learners, if you will, to see where the narratives imply a similar mechanism. And that way you can sort through the multiple reasons that people aren't learning English.
Okay, yes, thank you. That's more or less what I did. But
why haven't you? Why do you not feel like you're progressing towards an outcome?
No, what I consider was the learners, morphogenetic. What I did is first I tried to find out patterns. Yes, one of them was language learning. The ones who had been in private schools or in language centers. As well as you said, their parents had invested, although they were from low socioeconomic status, their parents invested. Well, and then I did the whole thing in their, and I tried to do their language learning stories and patterns. But the problem is that what after trying to provide the causal explanations, in my mind, what they had been morphogenetic is, for me, because they have moved to a better language, an English proficiency, because they had done something to become more proficient language learners. And the morphostatic are the ones who dislike English because of one of these students is a Mayan, and so he criticized that Americans come to our city and they don't learn Spanish, and that they take advantage from our natural resources. So it was interesting, but for me then he was morphostatic, but it's not.
But that's a consequence in Archer's terms of, she talks in terms of cultural tensions, within her 1988 book, and how people accommodate cultural tensions in different ways. They either live with them, in which case you might come to a conclusion that, to earn more money, I need to earn English. So even though I don't agree with these imperialists come from America, I'm still going to learn English. Or that then becomes something that they deal with by ignoring it and sticking to what they believe the cultural truth is. That these Americans are coming here and then they're not engaging with us. So that might offer an explanation of that case, that individual. So one strategy might be a comparative strategy. I've had students work on individuals as cases in terms of how they use technology and whether they use technology at work, and whether gender or class affects whether they use technology. And that allows you to get to the reason why. So this one doesn't use technology because they have a strong cultural reason. This one doesn't learn English because they have a strong cultural reason not to learn English. But someone else from the same background, from a class-based position, who aren't perhaps of that ethnicity, might not have that strong cultural reason for not learning English. Anyway.
Yes, and that's true. And here it says, could we say morphogenetic versus morphostatic agency? Is that I took it like that. I use Archer's terms in terms of their language learners' agency, but I think I was wrong. I have even finished my PhD, but I'm not satisfied with my study.
Well, whoever is, when I go back to my papers, I hate them. Sorry, Deepak.
No, I just wanted to add that, same thing. Like, I cannot look at my PhD thesis right now. Like, I can spot so many errors and problems. It happens with everyone.
Okay, I'm sort of conscious of time. We're 6:30 now, and for Deepak, it's getting late. He's talking from India, so You know, he's in a completely different time zone from most of us. You know, so I think we should show our appreciation to Deepak. It was a really interesting chat. You know, and as a nice introduction to some of the sometimes confusing terminology that exists in the field of critical realist research. So I'm gonna close proceedings there, and I hope you enjoyed the presentation. I think there's going to be another one in a couple of weeks probably, and I think that one is by Dave Eldervass. So if you want to ask him specific questions about how you're using his work, that will be a good one for you to attend. Okay, thanks very much for your time. Thanks again, Deepak, and thanks to all participants and everybody who asked a question. I'm now going to go away and have something to eat because it's dinner time in England. Okay.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
See you now.